you have fish living in one tank. Here's some of my fish. And fish poop. They poop and they pee and they breathe. And they produce something called ammonia, which and H4 plus. Maybe I shouldn't even try this. Am I right? Doesn't anybody know? H4.
Yeah.
Ammonia. Okay.
H3 or NH4+.
Yeah, NH4 plus. Okay. Ammonia.
I believe that's ammonium.
Ammonium, right? Which is okay.
Is it?
Let's just say it's ammonia, all right? You can check my chemistry on it later. They produce ammonia as a byproduct. Did anybody ever keep fish in an aquarium? Yeah, you know, you got to keep a filter going on that to remove the ammonia from the water because it builds up to toxic levels, and if it gets too high, your fish will die. But that ammonia is fuel for a biological engine if it is properly harnessed. So what happens in an aquaponic system is the water gets pumped out of the fish tank, and there's lots of different ways to do it, but the way I do it is I have it trickle through this bed. Would you see a photograph of right here, but I'm going to draw a little illustration just to make it a little clearer. I built like a little tray out of 2x4s, lined it with a rubber liner, and it has a 2x4 along the edge there too to keep it all contained. And I just filled it with gravel and planted it full of, anybody know this plant? Watercress, which is a plant, it's not, I don't believe it's native, but it's all over the place. I don't know if it's considered a good thing or a bad thing. But it is a really spicy, tasty green that grows like nuts. It grows prolifically. In doing so, creates lots of root networks throughout the gravel. Now here's what's really key. On the surface area of this gravel, you're basically creating habitat for microbes, for bacteria specifically, who denitrify the water. What they do is take ammonia and they convert it first initially into something called nitrite, then, which is fairly less toxic than ammonia. But then a second set of microorganisms convert that nitrite into something called nitrate, which is a form of nitrogen that is highly usable by plants. So these plants, the watercress, are growing in essentially a liquid soup of nutrients. So they grow prolifically, suck those nutrients out of the water, and then I harvest them. I just take scissors and just cut them routinely as they start to grow. And I'll tell you, this winter, that was a great crop. One excellent thing about having a bioshelter or a greenhouse of any sort is that you're producing off-season produce. And in the dead of winter, people will be happy to pay for fresh, local greens. Watercress in particular, it's really has that sort of a bitterness to it that some people associate, I guess, with blood cleansing. You guys ever heard of a group in Milwaukee called Growing Power? Yeah. Their biggest crop, their biggest cash crop, is watercress that is produced in conjunction with their aquaponic system. They can't produce enough to meet the demand from local restaurants. So this is just something I'm starting to tap into as far as figuring out how to market the stuff. I mean, I pretty much did it through local email listservs. I mean, again, one huge advantage of doing this work in cities is, I don't know, I mean, the way I see it is no matter how bad the economy gets, people are still going to have to eat. And if you're in a city, you've got a constant demand for your product, and your transportation overhead is close to zero. So it's a good position to be set in. So the water from the fish pond will trickle through here. There's also a ton of worms, red wigglers, living in the system who do a very important job of actually reducing the solids produced by the fish. They eat the fish poop and reduce its volume. After it's gone through here, it falls back into the fish tank, and you have happy fish with clean water.
Scottie?
Yeah.
The red wigglers are in the gravel?
Yeah.
Too?
Yeah. Can survive in water. Can survive in well-oxygenated water. Yeah, it's pretty incredible. You pull up a handful of that gravel, and it'll just be teeming with worms. I was surprised, and all I did is initially just seed them like a handful, and they just, now they're all throughout it. This water flowing through here it's highly oxygenated for one thing to begin with, but there's also, I imagine if they wanted to, they could come up for air, so to say, but they're pretty much underwater consuming solid materials. But you can, if you take a 5-gallon bucket and you put a fish pump in there and bubble it, toss an earthworm in there and it will survive for quite a while. I believe they have some capability to extract oxygen out of water, which might make sense considering that they can live in sometimes saturated soils.
How do you oxygenate the water?
How do I oxygenate the water? By making it fall as much as possible. This, I'll draw a quick little diagram here of how my system is set up. So I kind of have a 3-stage system. I've got the watercress bed right here. I got the fish in here. And then I have this third container here that has no fish in it. And this is actually what you see right here. It's a touch tank for kids. It's lower down inside of the child height so they can reach their hands in there. There's no fish in there, but there's crawfish, there's freshwater mussels, there's snails, all kinds of aquatic organisms and plants for them to pick up and examine. That's not really essential to the functioning of the aquaponics system, but it's cool. So it has a good value for that.
Do the oysters do some filtering and stuff?
They do. Technically, they're freshwater mussels. I have some friends who have a lake, and it's just teeming with them, and you're really not supposed to remove these from their natural habitat, but I did. I only took 3. Yes, an adult freshwater bivalve is capable of filtering up to about 80 gallons per hour. Bivalves are what we call filter feeders. They're constantly passing water through their bodies. That's how they eat. They remove microalgae and other nutrients from the water column. And they can make water quite clean. If you ever heard of zebra mussels before, which are a horrible invasive pest, the reason why they're such a problem is when they get into lakes and ponds, they're so effective at cleaning the water is that they remove all the available nutrients from it. That water will be crystal clear, but in doing so short-circuit the food chain for that entire system. You've heard of the word eutrophic or eutrophication before. The opposite of eutrophic is oligotrophic. That means an absence of nutrients. I don't know if there's a word, but oligotrophy. Fonts on these papers. So the water, I have a pump down here that pumps its water up to the beginning, and there's a cascade, it falls here, falls here. As much as you can get water to fall, that anytime you're breaking the surface tension of the water, that's allowing atmospheric oxygen to make its way in. And I also run an aerator to be supplemental, particularly in the summer, because warm water has decreased capacity to store oxygen than cold water, so it's more of an issue in the summer. Good question.
What's the volume on that pump?
It's 1,200 gallons per hour. Whatever pump you use should be capable of cycling the total volume of water once per hour. That's the general rule for sizing of pumps for an aquaponic system. Yeah.
Is your aerator in the one with the fish?
Yeah. I've got a little air compressor that runs air stones into here that just helps. I don't own a dissolved oxygen meter. Any dissolved oxygen meter that's worth anything is about a $1,000 investment. I'm just not willing to make it. So I just rely on sort of observational cues more so.
How much was the approximate cost for that setup?
This setup, well, we got a grant to do it, so I didn't work as hard to source cheap components. This tank right here, I salvaged it from an agway. They're about to cut them up with a chainsaw, so I got 6 of them, little 300-gallon tanks. We bought this big 500-gallon tank for, 900-gallon tank, maybe $500 for that one. This, I don't know, probably $100. Then the pumps and everything add up. But this is one thing that's very cool about this. It's a very scalable system. I have an aquaponics system in my apartment window in a 5-gallon pickle jar with a 1-gallon apple cider jug sitting on top of it. That cost me $30. Or you can, I mean, there's no, and you can scale this up enormously. I mean, you can scale it up and down in size and price accordingly. So you can build a system to meet your budget, whatever that happens to be.
Have you experimented with other greens?
What's that?
Have you experimented with other greens?
Yeah. So in aquaponics, a lot of people grow lettuces. They grow all kinds of vegetables. I've experimented with lettuces. They haven't done as well. Here's why I like watercress, because it's an aquatic plant. So whatever nutrients it requires are going to be soluble in an aqueous medium. Unlike other vegetables that, particularly things like potassium and phosphorus, are not always soluble. It may not be available. That's why monitoring pH is another aspect to this. You want a nice neutral pH all the time to ensure that micro and macronutrients are soluble and therefore available to plants. There's a lot we could say about this. I'm going to just jump through a couple things. So yeah, kids, great tool for them to come in. Fish, I mostly focus on cold water and native species, which include catfish, bullheads, perch, bluegill, koi, goldfish. What's that?
Can you just say it slower?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, catfish, bluegill, perch, bullhead, koi, carp, goldfish, and I do have some tilapia in there, which are neither cold tolerant nor native. I'm doing it as an experiment. I expect them to die in the fall. They'll die if the temperature drops below 55 degrees. A lot of people, when they think of aquaponics, they think tilapia is the only fish they can raise. Yeah, maybe it's a seasonal crop. But if you're going to try and maintain year-round tilapia production at this latitude, it's going to be an energetic loser and a money loser, because you're just going to invest in so much money into keeping that water at 55 degrees to keep them from dying. I think we need to develop markets for cold-tolerant and herbivorous species. I don't raise things like bass, the apex predators that, well, not exactly, but top-level predators that require a lot of high-level protein, and definitely not trout, because if the water temperature goes above 70 degrees, trout will die. And there's no way you can keep the water temperature down unless it's like in a basement, maybe. I mean, people raise trout in trout ponds, but they're typically spring-fed where the water's at a constant cold temperature. Wouldn't work in the greenhouse at all.
Did you ever use duckweed?
Yeah, I use duckweed all the time. In fact, I have a picture of duckweed right here. I have duckweed growing all throughout the system in all the little nooks and crannies everywhere. This is one of my favorite plants in the world. Tiny little 3-leaf floating plant. Capable of doubling its mass every other day or so under optimal conditions. Has a protein structure closer to an animal protein than a vegetable protein. Can be eaten by fish, can be eaten by chickens, can be eaten by humans. I scoop it out, I feed it to all the different critters in our system. Grows back the next day or so. There's another plant called Azolla that I grow it side by side with, and this one is actually a nitrogen fixer. It is it like a clover or a legume is capable of taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere and fixing it into a form where it's usable by plants. So in a lot of polyculture systems in Southeast Asia, they actually grow Azolla in the water in rice paddies, harvest it, and till it into soil. It's pretty cool stuff. This is
In Guatemala, the little pigs walk into the water.
What's that? The pigs?
In Guatemala, the little pigs walk into the water. The water's just hot.
And swallow up the duckweed? Yeah. Yeah, it's good stuff, they know. This is a plant that is a major invasive pest in a lot of parts of the world. Particularly in Africa, Lake Victoria has been totally taken over by it. It's called water hyacinth. However, up at this latitude, it will never survive a winter. The freeze will kill it. But in a greenhouse in a bioshelter environment, you can keep it alive. It has pretty phenomenal growth properties. Also, the reason why it's such a problem is because it does grow so quickly. But that's what makes it good for use in aquaponics and particularly also in wastewater treatment systems. In Austin, they actually had tertiary treatment lagoons for the city sewage, and they just had this floating out there. just to soak up the extra nitrogen, the extra phosphorus that was in the water. It can then be harvested, fed to ducks, chickens. Even my rabbits like they need it a little bit. And I make biogas out of it. If you're not familiar with biogas, it's a mixture of carbon dioxide and methane, and it's a combustible gas. There's whole villages in rural China and India that provide the majority of their energy through biogas, and they make it typically by anaerobically composting human and animal manures. I make it with this water plant because I've had tremendous success with this particular recipe. I've tried a lot of different recipes and not all of them work, but almost every time I use water hyacinth it works. And it grows in such abundance that I can just easily harvest it and put it into the digester, and makes a cool gas that you can light on fire. And I've never done anything practical with it other than teach, but maybe someday I will.
Was that bucket digester that floats?
Yeah,
Gas?
yeah. Let's see. Ooh, so, you know, continuing on this idea of creating closed-loop ecosystems, you know, for all my animals, which right now includes ducks, chickens, rabbits, and fish, I'm interested in trying to reduce my dependence on commercial feed as much as possible. In an urban environment, it's not really practical to do pasturing, which would be great if you have the space for it. You just typically don't have enough space to do that, and it's up to you to supply your animals with feed. But particularly with fish, it's said that a farm-raised fish, like a farm-raised trout or salmon, which are very common these days, require that between 2 to 5 ocean-caught fish are required to bring that fish to market, to grow that fish. Now, if the point of aquaculture and fish farming is to reduce our dependence on oceanic fisheries, then we're not accomplishing that by doing that. So it's really important to not be dependent on commercial feeds for raising fish. So I'm really interested in if it's possible to build a food chain for fish from terrestrial sources, particularly also right in a city. What's around us that can be used? So I've been playing around with a lot of different stuff. I mean, the duckweed is one. They love to eat that. If I have that in with the tilapia, it will be gone. They will eat all of it overnight. Not all fish are quite as herbivorous as they are, which is probably another reason why people raise tilapia so much, because they do eat lots of plants. The other fish do, just not as much. And another thing I've been playing around with is raising silkworms. These are a completely domesticated insect that's been raised centuries, millennia, I'm not sure exactly how long, for the purpose of making silk fibers. They start off as a tiny little caterpillar that hatches from its egg, spins a cocoon, and then hatches into a flightless moth that then reproduces, lays eggs, and dies. The fact that it's flightless is a sure sign that it's been completely domesticated, because it would have no way to survive in nature. These caterpillars eat only one thing, and that is mulberry leaves, which in Albany is a damn weed. It grows everywhere. I count on 20 or 30 trees within a couple block radius. So I can, on my way from my house down to the greenhouse, I can just grab handfuls of it off every tree that I pass. And there's a couple like weedy, even mulberry coppice things growing up around that I can just have been able to harvest leaves from and feed to these guys. They grow at a phenomenal rate. You know, in a couple week period, go from a tiny little thing to a caterpillar that's like that big. No, a couple of weeks. I would say maybe it's been I don't know, coming up on 2 months now. Maybe in a 2-month period, go from that to that, which is pretty fast growth rate, pretty impressive growth rate. And I don't do anything with silk. No one has ever, to my knowledge, come up with a successful silk industry in North America. People have tried, and actually right in Florence, Massachusetts, I believe there are tons of mulberry trees in that town. I believe they were deliberately planted to be food for silkworms that someone tried to create and it failed. So yeah, maybe we'll let a couple of them spin cocoons and hatch and lay eggs to start the next generation. But most of them end up as food for fish or for chickens, which they'll just readily devour. So it's sort of playing the food chain game. Arguably, it's better just to eat the mulberry leaves ourselves, which we can do. They're, however, less palatable and marketable than fish. You could also just eat the silkworms too. Plenty of people eat silkworms. You can buy cans of silkworms in Asian markets.
What percentage of your fish food do you need to buy and bring in?
99%. I'm just starting this, figuring out what works. Ideally, 0, but I'm not there yet. Other sources, worms from the worm composting system for my compost piles. Arguably, however, they're better for waste reduction. I've been messing around with trying to raise black soldier flies for a long time now. Have not been successful in this climate. Down in Austin, it was effortless because they were everywhere. They're pretty incredible organisms. If you want to go on YouTube and enter black soldier fly, you'll see some really revolting videos. But
I saw a aquaponics system that had, I don't know what kind of fish it was, but they were actually eating the roots of the water hyacinth. The water hyacinth would come down to nothing. You pull it out,
yeah,
the roots, but they were still alive, producing roots.
Yeah, I've noticed that pulling the hyacinth out of my pond, the roots are very short versus where I have them in the fish's pond. Yeah, I've had tilapia actually eat the bottoms off of the hyacinth. They'll if they get hungry enough, they'll eat just about anything, it seems.
So how big do you think you'd have to have in terms of mulberry system to make a serious dent in your food production? Have you looked into harvesting waste materials in the city, like bakery excess and things like that? And can you think of what problems you have encountered doing that?
As far as I haven't done the numbers on the silkworm thing. I'm still trying to raise them. I'm having this problem with this virus that's like turning their bodies into jelly at a certain stage. That I haven't figured out yet, so I need to clear that hurdle. But it'd be fun to do the math and figure out like how many would you actually need to produce. It would be a fairly intensive operation. It could at least be supplemental though, you know.
How cold can you get?
How cold? They want to be warm.
Like 80s?
They can take 70s. The thing is, you're limited by the mulberry leaf cycle. Too. In the fall, your operation, when the leaves drop, your operation is going to end. But what you can do is collect that last generation of eggs and keep them in the refrigerator until next spring, and then start again right there. So it's a seasonal operation. Or I guess maybe if you did it all inside of a greenhouse, but it would take up a lot of space. One thing as far as you mentioned bakery waste, down in Austin, we lived around the corner from a microbrewery. Every week would put out barrels of spent barley hulls. In the beer brewing process, the sugar gets used up, but the protein is still intact. That made an excellent feed for fish and chickens and ducks, provided it was eaten immediately. If it sits around for more than a day, it stinks worse than anything you could ever imagine. Even buried in a compost pile, it smells like death. Just horrible. I'm not kidding. Bad.
I'm curious about the structure and also the marketing of your educational programs. Is it mostly like field trips from public schools, or how easy has it been to get kids to come?
If we provide services for free, fairly easy. This is the issue. Schools have no budget, very little, to even go on any kind of field trips now, particularly a lot of inner city schools with a smaller tax base. Which is a big part of the reason why we located where we did. Accessibility. Kids are legally allowed to walk, I believe, with a 1 mile radius and back. So right there's about 10 schools that can walk to our site. This is the first year, and we actually there's a public Montessori school in Albany, part of the magnet school system. And they went through this first year with us, understanding that it was a work in progress. They wanted to see have the kids see it evolve over the course of a year. So that was great. We got to develop curriculum and test it out on them and see what worked. And I'm really hoping to scale that up this fall. Unfortunately, still all our program, it all has to be volunteer time, and it's been really difficult to acquire any kind of funding to provide educational programs. But as far as interest, yeah, I mean, teachers are all about it. You know, I get requests quite commonly to bring in kids in school, which I mostly will just do for free because I love it. But I would like to be able to provide more, you know.
So how many students did you reach in your first year, and how many do you plan to reach in your first year, or would you hope to reach?
I would estimate this first year, I mean, we had this class that was about 40 kids, and that was a big class to accommodate. That came a couple times. You know, we've kept numbers on it all. I don't have the numbers exactly offhand, but I mean, a lot of it's just informal. A lot of it's just me just being there and inviting passerbys to come on in. So, you know, over 100 kids, I would say, I've had just come in and just check things out informally. We've worked with a lot of the summer works programs, summer youth employment programs this summer, bringing in kids from there. Capital District Community Gardeners brought in a group of kids, at-risk kids who do urban gardening programs. Yeah, I mean, we have sort of this constant inflow. I would love to, I'm into, you know, being there all the time and take as many kids as I can. I mean, this September, both my girls are going to be in preschool, so I personally have a lot more time to be able to do that. And anytime I'm not actually, I teach in New York City, college level, but anytime I'm not doing that, I'm typically on site. You know.
I had a question about the grain from the brewery. Do you know, does that have live yeast in it, or do they pasteurize that somehow?
The yeast should be dead because it's, I mean, once the yeast produces the beer, then it's pressure, it's cooked under, well, or I don't know, or do they just interrupt that process and does it still have living yeast in it?
I'm wondering because I have a source for distiller's grain, which
right.
is actually distilled and essentially it's been through a heating process,
right,
which would have killed everything.
Killed everything in it.
If that would have the same problem, or if that would last longer.
See, my theory is that it had been sterilized, or at least pasteurized, and that's part of the reason why it stank so fast, is that it was a sterile medium and it had no indigenous microbiology, and so whatever opportunistic organisms just landed in there quickly colonized and putrefied it. I even had thought it might be possible to sort of inoculate it probiotically with even compost tea or something to get something in there that
right.
can slow down that decomposition process. It'd be, yeah, a cool thing to play with.
Right. But you think you could feed that to fish as a...
The whole grains, yeah. Distillery waste might be a little different because a lot of times they pulverize it and it's more like a mash.
It's a mash.
Yeah, which is trickier because if you throw that in the water, it's just going to cloud. The whole grains, however, would be something big enough that they could actually eat, you know?